You know when you see people eating food and it makes you really want some? Sometimes you're not even hungry, but just seeing how delicious it looks kind of feels good, right? 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 What's wrong? You want some, don't you?
Yes.
Well, that's because of dopamine. Let me explain. The moment you want something, literally anything, a bit of dopamine gets released into your brain. It might be subtle, but for a brief moment, that little bit of dopamine makes you feel good. And then it's gone. But then something else begins to happen. You start to really crave that thing you desire. That's because dopamine just gave you a taste of what you could feel if you went out and got it. And that's pretty much what controls everything you do. Your desires, your motivation, and your willingness to lean into effort all comes down to this single molecule called dopamine. But sometimes you just don't have the motivation to go after the things that really matter to you. And as soon as you need to put in a bit of effort is right about the time when you start making excuses and give up or choose an easier option. Like going for a walk when you're meant to go for a run, or getting takeaway when you're meant to cook, or watching porn instead of finding a partner. All of this is controlled by the dopamine system. So, let me show you how dopamine drives your pursuit for literally everything, how to get more of it, and how to accomplish anything with it. Okay, let's go. So what exactly is dopamine? Well, in your brain and body, you have a pool of dopamine that slowly refills over time. If you use too much dopamine before it replenishes, then you'll eventually be running on empty and you literally won't want to do anything. Basically, you'll look like these drug addicts who accidentally wiped out all their dopamine. And that's because if you want to do anything at all, you need both motivation and movement, which only occur through the constant production and release of dopamine. Dopamine can be released from different areas of your brain and body in two ways: tonic release and phasic release. Tonic release, which I'm going to call your baseline level of dopamine, is the constant flow of dopamine that actually makes you get up and pursue things in life. The higher it is, the more motivated you are to take on anything. Phasic release, on the other hand, only gets dumped into your system in response to something, and it determines what to pursue and whether to keep pursuing it. So the way it works is like this. You're constantly releasing a baseline level of dopamine that moves you towards the things you want. Well, as you keep experiencing life, you start wanting different things. So maybe you want to dance, or you want a cheeseburger, or maybe you just want to learn how to punch through wood. Well, the moment you desire those things, you experience a phasic release in dopamine that causes a small peak above baseline. But shortly after, that peak in dopamine drops below baseline proportionate to how high it was. It's this deficit that actually motivates you to go out and pursue the things you desire to bring your dopamine back up to baseline. Because as much as a peak in dopamine gives you pleasure, the drop below baseline gives you just as much pain. This isn't exactly a physical pain, it's more like the pain of not having whatever you want. So, you start learning to dance, you start punching wood, I guess, and hunting the cheeseburger. And I'm intentionally using a few examples because you're always pursuing multiple things at the same time, but they're all affecting the same dopamine system, which affects your drive and motivation for every pursuit. What do I mean by this? Let's say you start learning to dance and punching wood and your confidence begins to grow. This signals to your brain that you're on the right path and causes slight phasic releases of dopamine which motivate you to continue. Then, let's say you injure yourself and for some reason your teacher only feeds you plain rice until you recover. These negative experiences signal to your brain that you're no longer on the right track, causing a big decrease in dopamine and therefore less motivation to pursue them. So instead, you start eating cheeseburgers to make yourself feel better. But because the time it takes to achieve the cheeseburger goal is so much easier and shorter than the others, it ends up signaling your brain to stop pursuing anything else. At least for a little bit, depending on how good the cheeseburger is or how many you eat. This is what we call reward contingent learning, because your brain is learning exactly what it takes, how long, and how much effort is required to get that reward. And during the entire time, it's learning and deciding how likely you are to accomplish your goal, whether it's worth the effort, and whether or not to continue the pursuit. Just think of it like this. If punching through wood and doing a line of cocaine gives you the same huge spike in dopamine, for some reason, but one takes months of training and hard work, whilst the other takes minutes, then you'll likely choose the quick and easy reward. And that's largely because your brain is constantly trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. The hangover, the come down, the withdrawals, the pain of not having whatever you want. This is part of what causes addiction, because your brain is always trying to get back to that peak as quickly and easily as possible. And now that it's learned to expect dopamine without really putting in much effort, that's the most it's willing to do. But what's even worse is the more often you repeat the same behavior, you slowly reduce the number of things that bring you pleasure. Why? Because through reward contingent learning, your brain prefers behaviors it's familiar with while slowly forgetting or ignoring others. It might happen over days, months, or maybe even years. It differs for everyone. Relationships, school, work, fitness, sex, all these other things slowly become less and less appealing. In other words, there's a gradual narrowing of the things that bring you joy until eventually even the things you're addicted to begin to lose their effect. You've probably experienced this before. You work or study really hard during the week, and then the weekend arrives. You go out, you drink delicious milkshakes, eat amazing food, listen to music, smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, and maybe even... Then comes Monday morning when you have to go back to training, or work, or college, or simply get out of bed, but you feel extremely unmotivated to do anything at all. And it's not until a day or two later, when your dopamine recovers, that you start feeling like you can get some work done again. Well, that's because all that weekend dopamine abuse is emptying your dopamine reserves, leaving your baseline level much, much lower. Then, if you keep indulging every weekend, that becomes the only thing that brings you pleasure. But because you're repeating the same thing over and over, your baseline dopamine continues to plummet after every weekend until you finally experience no pleasure at all. To give you some visuals, imagine the capacity of this pool is your dopamine reserve and the water level is your baseline release. Well, as you smoke that tobacco, drink that milk, or eat that strudel, whatever releases a little dopamine, you experience minor peaks and dips represented by these waves. If these small peaks occur too often, or if you have one really big peak from an extremely rewarding experience, then some of the dopamine splashes out of the pool and brings your baseline lower. Do this too often without letting your dopamine replenish, and the pool will empty, killing any motivation. This is what's happening when you procrastinate when something's too challenging. Instead of increasing dopamine through hard work and accomplishing goals, you procrastinate with low-effort, high-reward pursuits to get the same reward. Like watching Netflix, scrolling TikTok, binging snacks, or snorting cocaine. By the time you're done procrastinating, you don't even have enough dopamine to accomplish whatever you set out to do in the first place. But lucky for you, there's an easy way to fix that. You know how some people are just really driven to do anything, anytime, anywhere? Well, that's because they have a healthy level of baseline dopamine. And that's exactly what you'll need if you want to truly believe you can accomplish your ambitions. And how do you do this? By taking care of the essentials: sleep, sunlight, exercise, and nutrition. When you sleep, your brain both directly replenishes dopamine as well as cleans out dysfunctional receptors that mess with your dopamine signaling. 7 to 9 hours each night is enough for most people, but I can't stress enough how important sleep is because it's the main thing that fills your dopamine pool back up. As soon as you wake, you want to make sure you get sufficient sunlight early in the day by facing towards the sun without staring directly into it. This leads to elevated mood and alertness throughout the day, and of course increased levels of dopamine. It's important to do this as early as possible without sunglasses or windows in the way. 10 minutes on a clear day and 20 minutes if it's overcast. Of course, just standing there and staring at the sun might get a little boring, so maybe you can get some exercise in at the same time. I'm not referring to hitting personal bests or breaking records, I'm simply talking about regular and consistent daily exercise. But why does this matter? Well, you're probably familiar with the euphoria you feel after exercise, right? But what's also happening is you're actually maintaining a higher baseline release, which isn't the same as temporarily spiking your dopamine. You're actually functioning at a more motivated state. And this makes a lot of sense now that you understand how closely connected dopamine is to movement and the need for it to actually pursue anything. Then there's nutrition, so eating the right foods. In specific areas of your brain and body, you have dopaminergic neurons that continuously produce dopamine from the amino acid tyrosine. All this dopamine is stored in your cells, ready to be released and replenished as required. And because the main source of tyrosine is from the foods you eat, then it only makes sense that you eat tyrosine-rich foods. So those include meat, poultry, fish, dairy, and you can Google the rest. There's a lot. If you keep these essentials in check, you're going to be constantly operating at a much more motivated state, which makes it easier to set goals you truly believe you can accomplish whilst having enough drive and motivation to actually achieve them. Unfortunately, this won't always be the case, and sometimes you're going to burn through dopamine at a faster rate than you can replenish. Well, the first thing I need to say, if it's not already obvious, is to slow down. Relax a little. Sometimes all you need is a week off work or training or your relationship, and then suddenly you're motivated to pursue them again. You really don't want to wait until you're running on empty, because once dopamine gets below a certain point, it's actually a lot harder to get it back up. But if you do get past this point, there's actually a way to speed up your dopamine recovery. How? By leaning into effort and making hard work the reward, doing things that you don't want to do. A simple example of this, and one I highly recommend, is taking a 2-minute cold shower first thing every morning. You're really not going to want to do it. But if you do this effortful thing, then what you'll get in return is a gradual increase in baseline dopamine of approximately 250% for the next 2 to 4 hours. That's the same level of dopamine you get after a line of cocaine, except the only difference is that this increase is gradual and sustained, which means when it wears off, it doesn't drop below the previous baseline. It just goes back to normal. Keep repeating this, and you'll start operating at a higher baseline in general. The most important thing to understand is that the more you don't want to do something, the quicker it'll rebound your dopamine. So if you start really enjoying the cold shower or the marathon and it's no longer a struggle where you have to tell yourself to keep going, then it's no longer hard work and won't speed up dopamine recovery. Of course, if you want to get the most out of your dopamine system, you can lean into effort even when your baseline is healthy. This is often referred to as a growth mindset. It's a way of thinking that if you haven't reached your goal, then it's only a matter of time until you do. And this is really the secret sauce, because what that represents is the confidence that everything you do, including failures and setbacks, until you accomplish your goal, are all lessons helping you towards success. Everything becomes purposeful. And with this in mind, your hard work not only drives you towards your goals, but every bit of effort is the reward, and therefore steadily increases your level of baseline dopamine, creating a cycle of unbending will and motivation to achieve anything.